This is Robert Fulford. Louis Armstrong and Jim Morrison, one old man and one young man, both died last week. And this program tonight is about both of them, a double obituary. Louis Armstrong and Jim Morrison were both musicians, both singers, and both idolized. In other ways, they were very different. Louis Armstrong's music at the best of times was tough and hard in the most beautiful sense, but to this generation and the last one, he presented himself as a gently charming figure, an entertainer of the old school. Jim Morrison of the Doors was, on the other hand, a brutal anarchist, a figure peculiar to rock culture, someone who couldn't have arisen anywhere else. He was an erotic and devastatingly effective performer who was sometimes called obscene, and who clearly saw his work on concert stages as a kind of political rebellion. Now I'm joined by Fred Landrell, an American freelance broadcaster and specialist in the rock culture, who has been in Toronto for the Mariposa Festival, and by Jack Batten, who writes about rock for the Toronto Globe and Mail. Jack, I wonder if you could tell me what place Jim Morrison held in rock culture. What was his status?
Well, he'd established himself in the beginning as kind of the first great erotic performer, I guess, in rock. But as these last 2 or 3 years have gone by, he entered into some kind of new phase. It's strange that where he was at the time he died, I thought he just put out a record called L.A. Woman, and though I've only heard it once, I think it's perhaps his very best record. He seemed to bring all the elements together, but at the same time, he seems to have lost a great deal of his audience. He was enormously popular at the beginning, but latterly, I think, teeny boppers and other people kind of deserted him. Have you felt some of that, Fred?
Yeah, well, he went through a period of being I guess anarchistic and very strange, which is a word which pops up in his poetry quite often, is the word strange, and liked to set himself apart, I think, from just about everyone else around. And then from that, he sort of modulated into a period where in the winter of 1969 or so, with an album called The Soft Parade, which was lots of strings and horns and soft flowing music behind these sugar-coated arrangements. And then from there came out with an album called Morrison Hotel about a year ago, I suppose, a year and a half ago, in which he was returning to an element which he said all along, which was something that he felt best in, and that was the Heartbreak Hotel, hard Elvis Presley, late 50s rock and roll, yeah.
Well, he died last week under mysterious circumstances, as Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, and Brian Jones have died in the last not too long period. A remarkable series of deaths in the rock world, all of very young people who have been at or very close to the peak of their fame.
I don't know what it means, and I don't want to pretend to interpret it, but those three major people who have died, Hendrix, Janis Joplin, and now Jim Morrison, they're all very sensual performers.
Yeah.
They weren't. Their music wasn't like say Beatle music, which is very organized and
right.
That kind of thing. Theirs was outgoing and
throwing it all out into the open.
Right.
Morrison, Jack Batten was just reminding me, wrote one of his poems in his book of poems. He wrote a poem about Brian Jones' death. Brian Jones of the Rolling Stones. And was Morrison obsessed with death? Was that a major theme in his work?
Well, it certainly recurs frequently. He tied Brian Jones's death with the mood in Los Angeles, kind of dying mood in Los Angeles. It's quite an effective piece of work. And yes, death does recur in his songs and his poetry.
Yeah, in fact, there are a lot of times, one example that I can think of that always occurs to me because it struck me the first time that I heard it was he did a song called Moonlight Drive, which he wrote when he was in high school, and if you listen, it pretty much sounds like it because it begins, let's fly to the moon and let's do this and that, and it kind of bounces along, but then the last line is something, something, and tonight we shall drown.
He didn't really start out to be a musician, did he? In fact, he wasn't a musician. He was a singer, but he wrote music. But he didn't really start out. He started out to be a filmmaker at the University of California.
That's right. He was in the film course at UCLA. I have this feeling about Jim Morrison. Like, it's possible in rock music, I think, to be a dabbler in rock and be very successful. Like you can't you can't say, well, I guess I'll be a jazz musician today, something like that. But it's possible to say, if you have a bit of talent and imagination and stuff, it's possible to say, I think I'll get into rock. And I have the feeling that's kind of what Jim Morrison was all about. He was in the UCLA film course, and another guy in the UCLA film course was Ray Manzarek, the organ player in the Doors, and they were talking one day, and it was almost, I gather, like Manzarek said, you write lyrics and I play the piano, let's form a rock group and make $1 million. And well, they did. But where Morrison started from at that moment was as a poet. He had some lyrics, and Manzarek looked at them and thought, wow, I've never heard these in a rock song. Let's have a group, and they did it.
You met him, didn't you, Jack?
Yeah. I was sent by the Star to Los Angeles just before he appeared. He and the Doors appeared in Toronto in September 1969 at the Rock and Roll Revival. It turned out awfully well. He was a difficult man to interview. You didn't ask a question and then relax for 15 minutes while he answered it. There was long pauses and that sort of thing, but once I kind of relaxed into it, it was a very unpleasant encounter, and the man was articulate, particularly about the film, which is what he wanted to talk about, not about
What were the films
music.
like? Did you see them?
Well, no, I didn't. They haven't had much showing at all. Vancouver,
They showed them in Vancouver.
they've had a Jim Morrison festival.
Yeah.
The film that he was working on then, he was just cutting, was called Highway, and it was about a hitchhiker who starts up out in the mountains above Los Angeles and hitchhikes down to the sea, and he goes through a number of experiences. It was a short film, about a half an hour. He was cutting it at this time. And Morrison had a hand in directing it and a hand in the music and everything, and he also played the part of the hitchhiker. Morrison was involved in all aspects of it: film, directing, writing, acting, music, everything.
He also did a film involving the Unknown Soldier, which was a song that he did, which portrayed that rather vividly.
He made a film using that as the background music.
Yeah.
Well, let's listen to that record now anyway. That's from the summer of '68, The Doors' Unknown Soldier. I guess in a way that's typical of his kind of rock, isn't it, Jack?
Yeah, well, that was theater. You can visualize all of that, and that's where Morrison was at, I guess. The films and the theatrical approach to rock, it all kind of fits together. I know when he played here in 1969 at the Rock and Roll Revival, and I went to see him, I was, tremendously thrilled with the visual aspects of it. The strutting and acting out the songs, particularly the end, and it made a terrific impact on me. And later, other people who had seen the Doors before and seen Morrison before said, it's the same old stuff, we've seen that. Well, I think perhaps why some of the fans left the Doors was because they thought they were seeing the same act over and over again. Well, I think he probably refined it. I think he was developing this great stage presence, and
I think it's certainly true that he did pull the same tricks in a lot of places, but they did change somewhat. I saw him 3 years ago in Philadelphia, and it was in a big old barn.
Yeah, well, what actually happened when he gave a performance?
In this instance, he came out to a crowd which I guess was ripe for Jim Morrison. It was about 100 degrees inside, literally. It was this old big building called the Arena, which was used for wrestling matches down in a sleazy section of Philadelphia. And there were about 20,000 people inside, and there was room for about 10,000, and they'd oversold by about 3,000. And the first two groups that came on were atrocious, and the producer was obnoxing people right and left every time he opened his mouth. So by about 3.5 hours into the concert, when it was time for the Doors to come out, people were ready to tear the place down. So the Doors came in a flourish of, dancing and jumping and walking on top of the policemen who were in front of them, and immediately opened with the song When the Music's Over, which is on record. It's about an 11-minute song.
Yeah, I think they always use that as an opener.
Yeah. Now, one thing which Jim Morrison did do, though, in the theatrics, which I think really shows that he had a lot of talent in his poetic abilities, was that he was able to improvise on the spot verses to When the Music's Over. And he did this in this instance and went through about 4 verses of incorporating exactly what was happening in a little 4-line verse of what was happening here in Philadelphia tonight at the arena.
We described the policeman.
It's hot. There's a fool running the place, and right there's.
He did that. He did that in New Haven, and that's what got him arrested.
Yeah.
I think what Jim Morrison looked like up on stage was a 1950s hood raised to high art. You know, there's a lot of that hoodie aspect about him. But
he also looked like an angel. His face, though, in repose in the photographs.
What kind of angels do you look at?
But he, you know, like with the leather pants, and he always had a dark top on, and kind of a mug's attitude, you know, but not raised to a considerable level.
Yeah.
That's the way he struck me, strutting and things like that.
We're talking tonight about Jim Morrison, the lead singer of The Doors, whose death in Paris was revealed a few days ago. I'm talking with Jack Batten and Fred Landerl. Fred, that lyric really is representative of a very important strain in Jim Morrison's work, eh?
That was pretty much the epitome of I don't know if he was trying to be that way, but he certainly was a strange fellow. It's a theme which constantly crops up in an album which he did called Waiting for the Sun. There was a theater piece in there called The Celebration of the Lizard, and there is some strange poetry in there.
He really said that what interested him was chaos and didn't he? I mean,
chaos, disorganization, and anarchy et al. That was his what he enjoyed. It was almost as if he never seemed to really fit into anything, because even the members of the Doors, who obviously when you work with someone musically, you get awfully close to them. There was the 3 of them, and there was Jim Morrison, always.
Yeah. Yeah, he was very, very much his own person.
I guess that accounts for a good deal of his popularity, because he's sort of for kids, he'd be kind of the ultimate outsider, because his split from his parents was very well publicized, and his
his father was an admiral in the U.S. Navy, and he was broken from them completely.
Right. The only thing that made him a conformist is that he's a drinker, not a drug user.
Yeah. He said in one song, the old get old, the young get stronger. They got the guns, we got the numbers. It may take a week, it may take longer. Come on, baby, let's take over. I mean, I think it was in a Toronto Telegram a little bit the other day that the writer Peter Goddard mentioned that Jim Morrison called himself an erotic politician. He was using sex and the sexual symbolism to make a political point, a point of anarchy, really, wasn't he?
Sure, yeah, and he was extraordinarily successful. He obviously upset what we call the establishment and the capital E, because his arrests, indicate
he's arrested for obscenity on the stage and so on. It would obviously drive older American adults crazy to see 10,000 children screaming with delight while he did those sexual gestures on the stage.
Right.
So
well, at his death, he was under sentence. When he had 6 months, he was waiting to serve
for obscenity on the stage in Miami, wasn't he?
Right.
A very, very odd hero of the late 1960s, now dead at a very early age. I think he was 27 when he died last week in Paris. Jim Morrison of The Doors. Well, thank you very much for being with me, Fred Landerl and Jack Batten.